understand about ancient Egypt is tainted by history seen from a Western European, not an African, perspective. To justify the slave trade and the colonization of Africa, myths were created that African people were inherently inferior and needed to be rescued from a barbaric lifestyle. We often hear about the greatness of civilizations in Rome and Greece, yet their philosophers were inspired by the studies at Kemetic universities and temples. It is in Kemet where the earliest well-developed records of human creativity and intellect are found. Let us go beyond inaccuracy, omission, and misrepresentation to the truth. Place at a special time, ancient Kemet.
For each of the past 17 summers, noted Kemet scholar and educator Dr. Asa G. Hilliard III has conducted an accredited study tour of ancient Egypt for his students and others interested in the history of the African continent. An internationally recognized expert on the ancient civilizations of the Nile Valley, Dr. Hilliard expands his knowledge of the continent's treasures by traveling and studying extensively throughout Africa. For the first time ever, Dr. Hilliard's tour has been professionally documented. Key Kemet sites and artifacts were filmed, along with Dr. Hilliard's compelling, evidence-based lectures. The goal was to create a visual product that gives viewers the sense of wonder and empowerment that comes from such a life-altering experience. First People, Our People, Ancient Egypt Revealed, represents a voice to be heard, a voice that resurrects a culture that has been stolen from, then misrepresented and ignored.
Join us as we begin at the 21st century and travel back through time to the very beginning of civilization, exploring the history of the first people, our people. During this journey, you will begin to understand the connections between yesterday and today. You will learn why the past is so important to our future, and you will learn the truth about ancient Kemet, one of the greatest civilizations of all time.
Why is learning about Kemet still important today?
No matter who people are, the past matters. And the only people who are total wrecks in the world today are the ones who have forgotten their mother, their father, their past wealth, and so forth. Because all of that tells you who you are. And part of the reason that so many of our young people are involved in destroying themselves, you know, that you have to say that. If I'm destroying my body through drugs, what have you, then to me that can only happen for someone who is not conscious of how important they are.
In America today, the struggle against oppression and for recognition continues. African Americans are the trendsetters for mainstream culture across the globe. Yet they were not embraced upon their arrival here and remain too often underappreciated, feared, and discriminated against. From the Civil Rights era, And through the Civil War, African Americans faced their greatest struggle for equality, dignity, and respect. Slaves stolen from African shores were tortured and forced to create a life on new shores.
Even before the time when Columbus was discovering America, Portuguese sailors began to explore the west coast of what Europeans called the Dark Continent. They soon set up trading posts and began the transatlantic business venture known as slave trading. Other countries, including England, quickly followed suit.
During this period, West African kingdoms, including Mali, Benin, Ghana, and Kanem-Bornu, began to rise. Islam, which replaced Christianity in the 7th century, became the dominant religion of northern Africa. It spread west and south across the Sahara.
Islamic leaders conquered Egypt and erected the first mosque in 640 AD. Arabs from the modern-day Middle East entered the region, bringing their religion with them. Revolt against the Romans and their imposition of religion began a half-century of unrest among the people. Shortly after the birth of Christ, Romans began their exploration up the Nile Valley and into Sudan. Though their initial presence in Kemet resulted in little change to the cultural climate, Christianity's earliest hold in Africa was in ancient Egypt.
The Greeks had preceded the Romans into Egypt. Early Greek philosophers studied at Kemetic universities and temples and described what they were taught in their writings. The Greeks began to imitate and copy much of the advances of Kemet, many times without crediting their sources. Before the Greeks, ancient Persia invaded Kemet, as it sought to extend its vast empire.
As we go back past 650 BC, we enter the 4 golden ages of political Kemet, a time when the greatest cultural advancements were taking place over a period of 2,500 years. This period ranges from 3100 BC up to 655 BC. These golden ages, representing 4 major kingdoms, covered more than 25 dynasties and were based on an African lineage.
Because of the richness of its documented treasures, this period is our focus. But it is also important to understand political Kemet within the framework of an even longer cultural impact.
The dynasties of the Golden Ages were preceded by periods where Africans made great contributions to mankind. Kemites looked to the south for their ancestral inspiration.
As with Kemet, the fertile Nile Valley also gave rise to the Nubian kingdom of Kush. It stretched for hundreds of miles, from Aswan at the north, through Ethiopia, into the Sudan, following the path of the mighty Nile River, known by the Kemites as the Hapi.
In order to better understand the events discussed in this video and when they occurred in time, we will follow a timeline extending from the year 3000 before Christ up until the present day. This timeline consists of 2 elements, a cultural timeline and a political timeline. The cultural impact of Kemetic civilization extends even further back, when philosophy and religion and a shared worldview first began to emerge. It is that deep thought which led to the ascendancy of political Kemet, a time when Kemet became an organized and complex society along the Nile, when monuments were built and the pharaohs ruled. Our primary focus is the period known as political Kemet, extending from the year 3000 BC up to the year 657 BC, when Kemet became known by the Greek name Egypt. The 4 golden ages of ancient Kemet span this period. In particular, we will concentrate on the first golden age, the Pyramid Age. This period, which was also known as the Old Kingdom, extends from 2665 BC to the year 2160 BC. The second golden age, the Literary Age, also known as the Middle Kingdom. This era ranges from the year 2040 BC to 1784 BC. Next is the Third Golden Age, the Imperial and Temple Age. This age was called the New Kingdom, which spans the years 1554 BC through 1190 BC. The fourth and final Golden Age, the Revival Age, was also known as the Late Kingdom. It extends from 720 BC to 657 BC.
Nubia was also an advanced and sophisticated civilization which deserves further exploration and study. However, at this time, our greatest source of documented evidence is based in the era of political Kemet. That is where we will focus our attention.
When did the distinct culture that we call Kemetic begin? Certainly not 5,000 years ago, when the nation was united from two lands and called Kemet. So that there is a cultural ancestry that is longer than the national ancestry. In other words, people's way of life predated the formation of the nation. If you know enough from watching the stars to have knowledge of the precession of the equinoxes, so if you observe and record astronomical phenomena, if you do that, then you have produced culture. Common knowledge that people had, that's one of the definitions of culture. Then what you believe that information means about the stars, that becomes part of your worldview. What's your relationship to them? How do you answer that question? A common answer to that question means you share a worldview. That's culture. So people had common answers to common questions, many of which we can see, especially in the pyramid and Hora Maket. When the indigenous people of the Nile Valley ran it, they named it. And what did they call it? They call it Kemet. Sometimes they call it Tawi. Sometimes they called it Tameri, but never Egypt. Kemet was finished after Dynasty 25, and it became Egypt. After the 4 golden ages of Kemet.
Is Kemetic history fabricated?
Much of the history of Kemet is fabricated. And even the term Egypt, you know, it's fabricated. You know, that's Greek. It takes away from Kemet, Tawi, Tameri, the real names, you know, the inability to follow text. And we know that right now there are literal cultural wars over what Egypt was. It's these people that we want to know about, not just that they were black, as I said. I mean, that's a tired argument after a while. Who's black and how black are they? It gets sick after a while too. But we have to do that to keep people from stealing something even more important than our phenotype, and that is what's on our mind. What do these people have on their mind? Notice I use the term philosophy and religion. And I use it deliberately because the same people who didn't want the mummies to be black, Kemites to be black, also didn't want them to think. They wanted them to be underdeveloped. They wanted them to be mythopoetical, but not philosophical, not thinkers, not creators, not scientists, when they were indeed not only philosophers, but the original philosophers, as far as any records go. The term Seba then appears in some of the pyramid texts, a definition of Seba, of what it meant, which sounds like a dictionary definition in the Western world for philosophy, meaning African deep thought and deep thinking. Obinga tells us that this term Seba, S-B-A, Seba, if a Greek person wrote it, would be S-P-H-A, Sefa. Sophia. Philosophia. Philosophy. That's what a Greek would say in order to say what an African had said. Why would you even be concerned about it? Because the Greeks bragged about going to Africa to study philosophy and came home and named it something that has no etymology in their own language. You don't have philosophy till you have method. So Obinga showed, for example, without going through all of this, what it says is here are the 6 steps in a method of solving problems. And now historians of science say that the Greeks invented the scientific method. The date on the Kemetic math textbook that has the method in it is 1500 to 2000 before the birth of Christ. It cannot be any younger than 1500 BC. In Greece, it cannot be any older than 600 BC. We can't be any younger than 1500, and the Greeks can't be any older than 600 for the same method. That should be a rewrite of the history of science. If you say method is the essence of philosophy, it would be ideal if we could start chronologically and to actually begin in Ethiopia, in Tanzania, in Uganda, at the sources of the river, which the Kemetic people call the Hapi. And we today call it the Nile. And they faced in that direction in order to get their bearing. They faced south. In fact, their word for face and the word for south are identical. They said that they had come from the sources of Hapi. The source is not named the Tigris and the Euphrates. It's not named the Blue Danube or the Huang Ho. They were very clear about who they were and where they came from. And we know the political reasons why it's important to believe that the pyramid builders came from somewhere else, anywhere else but Africa. Any people but African people. Space people, if you will. Disappeared people on islands, but not African people. Couldn't possibly be the same people that became oppressed.
What are some dynamics of oppression?
If you study oppression carefully, it's very orderly. Oppression has certain rules. You have to make sure that the group loses any bonded identity. You can have any identity you want as long as you don't think you belong to the people that are part of your ancestry. So that's a destruction of collective identity. Then you must teach that the group that is doing the oppressing is in power because of its genetic superiority. The cultural connection between Kemet and Central Africa is not the same, not matched in any way by cultural connection with Mesopotamia. These are African people. They're African culturally, African physically, and they look to the sources not only for the water, but for their heritage. That's what they said, that was their family. What's the difference between a dynasty and a kingdom? A dynasty is simply a group of people who are related by blood, a family of people related by blood. Kingdom is a sequence of dynasties that is unbroken either by disintegration or by outside invasions. What's a golden age? That's the age where you really got it going on, money-wise, politics-wise, science-wise, education-wise, socialization-wise. That's why that's called a golden age, the pyramid age. And we have that locked in around 3,000 years before the birth of Christ. So the first dynasties that we began to look at had to do with where the political center of the nation was located. Nefer was the center of government in the earliest dynasties.
The Pyramid Age, or Old Kingdom, represented a period of rapid development in ancient Kemet. This civilization thrived both scientifically and philosophically. The Kemetic culture of the Pyramid Age developed a level of deep thought that led to advancements in philosophy and theology. The higher social organization and stability which came with that deep thought was the foundation for the creation of architectural marvels like the pyramids. Kemetic culture of the Pyramid Age studied nature in order to create rules about how the elements of the universe were defined and interrelated. In essence, the systematic observation and study of the environment was the basis of what became the Kemetic worldview.
We have literacy in Kemet from the very first dynasty, in fact, from pre-dynastic times. One of the beautiful things about Medu Neter that stops all arguments is that all the figures in Medu Neter are common animals, common plants, common tools that happen in the Nile Valley. Why are there no camels in the Medu Neter? Because camels are not native to Kemet. If the glyphs were there 3100 BC, and before that, the culture was there. They had a man that got interested in that question, whether this pharaoh who built that middle pyramid is the same one represented in Horemakhet the Sphinx. I refuse to accept the conventional wisdom that Horemakhet is Ka-Afre, which means he's later than the Great Pyramid. I refuse to accept that. The evidence is all against that. He doesn't look like Ka-Afre. This is Ka-Afre, the one you just saw. This is Horemakhet. They don't have the same face. One's prognostic to the extreme, the other isn't. Look at this, the facial angles and everything. They're not the same face at all. Why do they want to argue that? They want to make the Sphinx young. They want to make it younger than Mesopotamia. High cheekbones, phenotypically African. Prognosticism, phenotypically African. Large, soup-cooling, kissing lips, phenotypically African. Wide, air-gathering nose. Those phenotypes that are most typically African, that's what the Horemakhet had, and that's why it's important to stop there. Anytime you start talking about old Africans, somebody's going to tell you about the Phoenician. They had the shipping, and African didn't have shipping. You already see that that's false. African had fleets of ships. They used to go to Phoenicia, what would become Phoenicia, to get their cedar. In Lebanon, they go there and get the wood. But nobody came from there to teach these people how to sail. And you have to respect the fact that these are people, among other things, who had very sophisticated study of solar, stellar, cosmic phenomena. Sahu is the Kemetic name for Orion, with the 3 stars in the belt, called a hunter by some. Khafre, Menkaure, and Khufu, their 3 pyramids are, the 2 of them are in a line, but one, the little one, is off to the side. That's exactly the same thing that's happening in the 3 stars in Orion's belt, which they were preoccupied with as observers and wrote about. The shaft in this great pyramid over here, that shaft, if it went all the way through 12,500 years ago, it would have focused on the first star in the 3 stars in Orion's belt, and the ancient Kemites called that Osiris. And Osiris is the god who was dead, buried, and resurrected. And they found if they superimposed these things, that what they were doing was trying to build heaven on earth. They were trying to copy what was above, below. As above, so below. Because these are a connected people, not an alienated people. A connected people. They didn't see themselves alien to anything in the whole cosmos. And so they found a way to interpret in terms of themselves what was going on. Horemakhet is actually facing due east. And if you crank the clock back to 12,500 years ago, it would have looked at itself rising with the sun, a helical rising. That is Leo in the sky, being watched by Leo on the ground. At the same time that the shaft of the pyramid is pointing to Osiris. But here are people watching the living drama of heaven, the order, things that go around and come around every 26,000 years. I'm a living part of a living universe, and all I see is order. All I see is reciprocity. When I look in the stars, all I see is balance. So what I want to do in my art, I want to produce order, balance, reciprocity, and harmony in the structures that I make, and I want to make them reflect Ma'at.
What was the Kemetic Book of the Dead?
There's nothing in Egypt called the Book of the Dead. A German scholar who found some text associated with burial named it Das Totenbuch, which means the dead book. And from that, the name, the Book of the Dead. All it takes is the study of the texts themselves to find out that there are no texts that have to do with death. All the texts have to do with life. In other words, the whole purpose of it. In fact, the name that was given to this text by the ancient Egyptians themselves is the Pert Imhru, which means the book of coming forth from darkness into light.
The weighing of the heart represents the final judgment in assessing how an individual lived his or her life. Here, we see the deceased man kneeling in front of the judges. After passing the scrutiny of the judges, the deceased man is led by Anpu to the place where his heart will be weighed on a scale against the feather of Ma'at. In order to pass on, the heart and feather must balance each other. The lightness of the feather can only be balanced by a light heart that is not weighed down by sin. If one has lived in a noble and justified manner and has attained balance, then he will be judged to have lived his life with righteousness, justice, order, and a balance of harmony and reciprocity. Jehuti, the scribe, master of the word, and God of wisdom and writing, ensures the accuracy of the weighing and that the deceased man is Ma'akaru, or true of voice, and therefore justified to move forward. After Jehuti has ensured the man's worthiness, Heru, the son of God, then leads the man to the throne of God, Osiris. His wife Aset and her sister Nephet stand behind. Approaching God, Osiris represents the final step in the weighing of the heart.
Ma'at embodies all that is right in Kemet. From Ma'at, we get the origin of spirituality and the association of religion with the cosmos. It integrates the political system, the social order, and humanity, individually and collectively.
How many gods did the Kemites have?
Didn't have many gods. They had a single conception of God. If God is one, that God is alone. No other existed without God. God is the one that's made all things. God is mother, God is father. He's mother of mothers, father of fathers. He made everything and so forth. It goes on like that. Very clear that they believe in one God.
Lessons of Ma'at were formed in a series of symbols that the Greeks called the Ennead, or the Nine. This grouping of 9 symbols represented the 9 primary forces of the natural order and how they are reflected in religious icons. Greeks looked at these symbols and assumed that Kemites, as they did, worshipped multiple gods. However, in Kemetic culture, the 9 represent multiple aspects of one God.
And as a whole person, you have to function in all those areas. You have to be a scientist investigating things. You have to be a person who has values and behaviors that fit the Ma'at notion. Remember now, we're talking about symbolic thought. We're talking about metaphor. We're not talking about history. We're talking about finding a way to express. Look, here's the African worldview. Now I'm saying not Kemet, but African worldview. All you have to do is go all over the continent. And Africans all over the continent believe the world is alive. Africans believe the entire universe, the entire cosmos is living, breathing, throbbing, changing. And so they interact with it in that way. Listen to this. I am a part of the cosmos. The second element in the African worldview. The world is alive. I am a part of the world. I am alive. And as an alive part of the world, I behave in an interactive way with the world, following the same living rules that the world follows. And for that reason, I can study any part of the world and I can find myself in it, or I can study myself and I can find the cosmos in me. So therefore, when I make symbols, I can tell my story by talking. I can tell my story by symbols. But the story that I'm telling is about the relationship that I have with the cosmos. In other words, I have an obligatory relationship with the cosmos, whose main rule is what? What's the main rule? Ma'at. Intermediate period. What's an intermediate period? Intermediate period, the loss of political power. They couldn't keep all of these sections of the country together. No invasion, it just broke down. And then they got it back together again. Second golden age.
Kemetic culture of the literary age, or Middle Kingdom, drove further developments in science, architecture, and literature. The literary age brought advances in mathematics and the initial development of the Valley of the Kings, which are intricately designed underground burial structures rooted in the earlier noble tombs of the upper region of Aswan. A marvel of scientific and architectural application, the tombs in the Valley of the Kings are carved deep into the heart of mountains on the western banks of the Nile. As the name suggests, with the literary age came the proliferation and expansion of various types of literature, ranging from mathematical and medical text to civilization's first recorded poetry, short stories, and epic plays.
And that's the age of the explosion of books and libraries. The Alexandrian Library was not the first library in Kemet. In the 4th dynasty, they had in the king's cabinet a man who was called governor of the House of Books. In the 4th dynasty, which is in what kingdom? Old Kingdom. And when is Alexander the Great? So if he's building libraries in 332, notice that that's after all 4 golden ages, right? This is the highlight, I think, of the great movements in Kemet. So that in the 11th and 12th families, which is the called by Egyptologists the Middle Kingdom, and some of us prefer to call that the literary age. Why literary age? Because you got masterpieces of science and philosophy in the Middle Kingdom. You have the Ren Mathematical Papyrus, that is the papyrus itself dated to the New Kingdom, but it's supposed to be based on work that goes back to the Middle Kingdom. With Meta Neter, you not only have geometry, which is supposed to have been invented by Pythagoras, who is not born yet, But it goes beyond geometry to trigonometry and pre-calculus. Not to mention literature, what we call literature. That is epic plays, poetry. Wouldn't you say that's literature? So we're justified to say that this typifies what was happening there. This changes the orientation of who these people were and of who Africans are by extension. There had been a gap from the late 500s AD until 1822 when no one could read Meta Nature. So the literature was there, but it couldn't be read, except for the fact that this trilingual tablet was made. These names were located on the Rosetta Stone. The name of Ptolemy, P-T-O-L-M-Y-S, Ptolemy. Once that was recognized, they knew that the reference would be to Ptolemy, and they knew that there would be a reference to K-L-E-O-P-A-D-R-A, Cleopatra. And with these, learning that the alphabetical, what the alphabet meant, and these names then enable them to apply them to African names such as Ramez, Ramesu, Ramesses.
How does most media depict ancient Kemet?
One of the things that we can say, if you look at popular film on Kemet, is that fundamentally almost all of them are propaganda pieces. And you can also say that there are favorites that Europeans like to see in their film. They feature certain people over and over and over. One favorite is Ramesses II. They love doing films on Ramesses. Some think he's the pharaoh of the Exodus. Then they have two queens they like. And both of them are foreigners. They like Nefertiti. Nefertiti is from Persia, sold to the pharaoh and becomes the queen by that route. And then they like to show Cleopatra. Cleopatra was a part of a family of generals. When Alexander the Great came to Kemet and called it Egypt, he had generals with him. He died as a young man, and his generals took over, the Ptolemies. That was her family.
The Cairo Museum is one of the most famous museums in the world, housing a priceless collection of Kemetic artifacts. Oddly, though, there are inconsistencies in chronology and in the placement of important Kemetic figures. Is it an example of gross carelessness, or possibly a more sinister attempt to misrepresent the true history of ancient Egypt? For example, Mentuhotep I, founder of the 11th dynasty, and Amenemhet III, two of the most important figures of the literary age, are not showcased and often unidentified.
These are people you don't see. This pharaoh, Senwosret, the Greeks call him Sesostris, founded a major operation, particularly the contribution that he made to the establishment of the university system of Ipet-i-Sut. And this is the place where the deep thought of Africa was taught, and the deep spirituality and the high value system. All of those things emerged out of Ipet-i-Sut. These are awesome, awesome pieces, built over time by several per-az, or pharaohs.
Minor figures with more Eurocentric features are more prominently displayed and often the focus of guides offering museum tours.
Most people come in and they want to spend time because there's so much stuff on King Tutankhamun. And you could spend years on just his stuff alone. But Tutankhamun was a boy king that didn't do anything other than hold a job for a little while before they probably tried to kill him because he was in the way of powerful people who wanted to do certain kind of things. And that's nice to see the jewelry and all of that. But what we want to see is the people here, who they were and what they were up to, because their belief system still contains things that are useful for us today. In ancient Kemet, science, the study of science, is the source of religion. In studying that, what do you see? Patterns. And what are the patterns? They reflect the forces of the cosmos. And the better you understand the forces of the cosmos, when you understand all of them, you now understand better what the Creator's principles are, and that those principles, since you're part of the cosmos, apply to you just like they do to the rest of the cosmos. So they spend a lot of time studying and thinking, and that's what we call philosophy. What happens after the Middle Kingdom family? We get a group of foreigners that invade Africa for the first time. There's no record before this. And they came in and took over Kemet for 150 years. Nothing happened to the culture. In other words, this culture stays intact. Even though we had invasions by the Hyksos, it never changed who the Kemites were. After the Hyksos were kicked out in Dynasty 18 and 19, the Golden Age began, and the character of Kemet changed.
The Imperial and Temple Age, a new kingdom, brought a change in the Kemetic culture and value system. After expelling their conquerors, the Hyksos, the pharaohs created a large standing army intent on protecting Kemet from future invasions. That military buildup resulted in the expansion of the area ruled by Kemet to include Mesopotamia and parts of Greece. A newfound emphasis on militaristic culture created a new value system associated more with defense and conquering, and with less emphasis on nature and spirituality. All emphasis on deep thought was not lost, however, as the Imperial and Temple Age brought the expansion of the University of Apetasut, a great center of higher education at Waset. There, ideas based on deep thought and spirituality again surfaced.
It's a golden age because they're in charge of themselves again. It's a golden age because now they're building these magnificent tombs and temples. Some of us call it the Temple Age. It's also the Imperial Age because in order to keep people from coming in and taking over the country again, they establish a standing army that is 1/4 of the nation. But guess what having that proportion of your population devoted to military tasks means in terms of your culture? 18 can't be like 12. 18 can't. A war footing changes your value system. Everything inside that white box in the 18th and 19th dynasties is ruled by Kemet. That means in 1500 BC, Africans rule Mesopotamia. That's the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. That is part of the Mediterranean, part of the Aegean Sea, part of Greece was ruled by Africans 1,500 years before the birth of Christ. This is the Queen Mother that started it all. Queen Tetisheri. Her son had a daughter, Nefertari, Queen Mother of the 18th dynasty. That's her cousin, Lady Ray. Look, this is royalty, folks. This is not slaves. This is not captives. These are queens, princesses. I think we're depriving our kids of what they need in order to be whole. Eventually, they built Apetasut. I remember going to the Parthenon and going up, to the Acropolis, seeing that. I'm just amazed, And then I came here. That's a teeny-weeny temple. Built what date? around 500 years before the birth of Christ. Well, what's the date of the White Chapel, which is the oldest building inside Ipeti Sut? 12th dynasty. We're talking 2,000 years before the birth of Christ for that building. And it's dedicated to Senwos Ret, Keper Kare. And this is the place where the deep thought of Africa was taught, and the deep spirituality and the high value system. All of those things emerged out of Ipeti Sut, Luxor, which is, they call it the Temple of Luxor. It's the southern Rizwet, or the southern temple. These are a pair. They're connected. They're connected by an avenue of rams-headed sphinxes between these two temples. They will use different zoo types, as they say, or animal types to represent as a symbol whatever it is that they choose to represent. So that in the case of the ram being one of the zoo types used here to represent the deity. And so you just have a whole row of rams, in fact, connecting the temple of Ipeti Sut with the southern Rizwet, or the southern temple, Luxor temple. The Arabs call it Luxor. They thought it was palaces. They thought temples were palaces, so they call it the palaces. This was the center of government and the holiest spot in the world.
What kind of roles did women play in ancient Kemet?
Quite a few, all the way up to king. Hatshepsut was king, and there were two others before her. There were women in the priesthood. You know, they were extremely important in that regard. They were important as figures, as symbolic figures of the divine. The feminine principle was always very important in Kemet. They were the mothers of the king. Their blood had to, only their children, only the queen's children could be king, not the king's children. King had no authority to pass on his authority.
This is Hatshepsut, the woman that ruled Kemet as king during a portion of the 18th dynasty. Though women had ruled in Kemet before her, Hatshepsut was clearly the strongest. As a female ruler, she wore the symbolic garments of authority, including the artificial beard of the male pharaohs. Buried in the Valley of the Kings, Hatshepsut built the largest tomb, one that triples the size of even the greatest preceding rulers. It lies out in the open for all to see, while others are carved into the side of mountains. In the upper region of Aswan, she commissioned the building of a giant Tinkanu, or obelisk as the Greeks called it. That design has been the foundation of other monuments, from those found at the University of Ipeti Sut to our own Washington Monument.
When Hatshepsut built her temple, she has a trip that she immortalizes by writing the story of the trip they took from here all the way to Somalia on the Red Sea. It's a precise copy of living things. So it's literally a biological record of what was happening in the Red Sea. And so you will find that these are not just artist conceptions of fish. These are actually fish that live in the lakes and in the stream. This is Queen T, little statue in the Berlin Museum, right along with the very famous statue of Nefertiti. In the same museum, but you never see this one, you always see that one. She is the mother of Akhenaten, and some people say King Tutankhamun as well. Akhenaten, the one that's supposed to be sick because of his body formation and everything like that. They even gave him a disease called Froelich syndrome, which makes you sterile. He had 6 daughters, and his little brother, King Tutankhamun. And then you see what happens when they get it for the video games in the United States. And now many kids, million of them are gonna grow up thinking this is King Tut. So when they see this one, they'll think he's a fake. Schuyler de Lubitz's work was ridiculed for a long time. Now people are beginning to pay attention to it. He says that if you take any proportional skeleton of anybody that's proportional, not deformed, you can superimpose it on top of this building, and that it wasn't a mistake that when you walk into it, it looks crooked, that what this gives you is the impression of movement, that the building is a human being walking, if you look at it from the top. And that the covered temple represents all those functions in the top part of the body. And for example, in the peristyle court, which represents the thoracic cavity and so forth, if you go into that section of the temple, you'll get images of birth, you'll get all kinds of things that are associated with the functions that are performed in this part of the body. These are awesome, awesome pieces. You get hints of what it was like when you were in Ipeti Sut. You look up in the ceiling and you see the colors, some of the colors that are still left. Can you imagine when the whole thing was brilliantly colored? 100 people can stand on top of one of these columns, each column, and they're flooded with columns, which is building an imitation of a forest. That's what it is. And later they will have something called Greek architecture, which will copy this architecture and no one will give it a footnote. A temple like Ipeti Sut, what was on their mind to make them take the wealth of the land, the intellectual and spiritual energies of the people, to frame structures like these, and then to say when they framed them that we are building for eternity. And the Pharaoh, Per-Ah, his job as ruler was to protect Ma'at, to protect the order, to protect balance, harmony, reciprocity, to protect that. That's his job.
Kemetic leadership was reflected by members of the priesthood and by the pharaoh. Both had the responsibility of maintaining the divine order and ensuring that Kemetic society revolved around the teachings of Ma'at. Not only did this mean ecological balance, but it also included balance inside one's soul based on one's deeds and actions. Truth, justice, social harmony, and spiritual balance can get lost in the race for personal gain or protecting one's own interests. This leadership style differs from much of what we see in modern times, where the focus is on building profits and the economy. Kemites, too, were concerned with creating success for their society, yet concentrated on maintaining balance with nature and their universe in the process.
The Revival Age, or Late Kingdom, was ruled by a group of Africans from Nubia who sought to lead Kemet for what turned out to be one last walk in the sun. Although they maintain a military presence in Kemet, this group of pharaohs looked to restore the previous culture and value system by finding inspiration in the leadership of earlier dynasties, particularly the 11th and 12th dynasties of the literary age. This cultural restoration remained in place until the invasion of the Persians. Some Egyptologists fail to recognize this period as a golden age of Kemet because they do not know or acknowledge that Nubians to the south were actually part of the same cultural legacy as the Kemites.
Did Nubians exist in ancient Kemet?
Nubians not only did exist, they do exist. They're still there in the same place that they've been for thousands of years in the south of Egypt. Many of the Nubians have been moved by the Arabic-speaking people, and many have mixed in with the Arabic-speaking people. But if you go all the way to Aswan, and you go out onto Elephantine Island, you have people who've been there for a long, long time. And they're Nubians, and they are black people, clearly black, I mean, not shaded and everything else. Let's look at the period after the 18th dynasty, another breakdown. Not really invasions. The big invasions, the next set of big invasions come after the Africans from Nubia came in here, took this thing over, and then ran it, as Dr. John Henry Clark said, for their last walk in the sun one more time to show them how to govern. And then they didn't go to 18 for their inspiration, they went to 12 for their inspiration. So Dynasty 25, that family of Africans from Nubia skipped Nefertari and Nefertiti and Tutmosis, they skipped all of them, went straight back into Dynasty 11 and 12 for their inspiration. Why? Because it was a purer form of value system. That's what they did. So I think that confirms that there was a deterioration in the 18th dynasty of the value system as it operated. And then you can say it was all over after that. Why? Because Persians came in and they brought with them political control. After the Persians, we get Greeks coming in, bringing political control. Edfu and Kamambo are temples built during the Greek and Roman occupation. So you're going to see images that look more like Greeks and Romans. And so that should not confuse you. The people who built the temples were native Kamites. No Greek, no Roman came here, built any temple. So when somebody says a Greco-Roman temple, it means a temple built by Kamites during Greco-Roman occupation. That's extremely important. So they thought Alexander the Great would get them loose from the Persians, and in a way he did, because he seemed to permit the continuation of the culture. And then after Alexander, the Romans. And for a long time, Romans didn't do anything in here to mess up. And the first culture war was declared by the Romans. The culture war by the establishment through Constantine of the church as a political tool of domination.
What are some aspects of domination?
You must take control of the education and socialization process. There can be no independent education, independent socialization, even if people on the bottom get the resources to create socialization structures in school.
Constantine the Great, as he is known, was the first Roman emperor to promote Christianity and initiate the evolution of the Roman Empire into a Christian state. At his request, the Council of Nicaea gathered to talk about the virgin birth and the Apostles' Creed.
However, Constantine's main interest was not worship, but rather increased political power. He used the church as a political tool of domination and used Christianity to formulate a common belief around which the Roman people could unite.
As Constantine attempted to impose Christianity as the official religion in Kemet, he met resistance from a Kemetic priesthood that professed a worldview theology which was considered highly credible by the natives.
What are some other dynamics of oppression?
One of the rules for oppression is that you must destroy the memory of oppressed people. You do that by burning books, by obliterating the record, by chiseling off the faces of people on the walls of temples, by destroying statues, by killing priests, and whatever it is. And that's a global rule, and it applied definitely in Africa.
In an effort to counter opposition and obtain control, Constantine orchestrated a culture war designed to destroy the Kemetic priesthood.
Romans destroyed Kemetic temples and monuments from the Nile Delta up to Aswan and Philae Island. If the Romans could not tear down and destroy the temples, then they would methodically scratch images of Meta Neter off the walls and make bonfires out of books in order to cover the temple walls in soot.
Romans also destroyed schools, including the last school where Kemites taught their culture. The teaching of historical Kemetic culture was terminated in Kemet by the Romans. Yet, through revisiting ancient lessons, we have the opportunity to ensure that the Kemetic ways of life are revived and passed on to future generations of the African diaspora.
When did the way of life change? After massive migration of Arabic-speaking people following the religion of Islam. That's when the way of life changed.
Generations have been systematically misled by historical propaganda and media myths about ancient Egypt. Yet Kemet This great center of learning and culture must no longer be ignored, misrepresented, or undervalued. It was the cradle of science, philosophy, spirituality, and the arts, representing complex societal structures and deep thought.
Some still do not want to believe that Black Africans were not only capable of, but did in fact create some of the world's greatest monuments of architecture and lasting models of religion and education. In addition, Kemet's highly evolved government and business infrastructure and substantial level of social consciousness allowed it to thrive for thousands of years. The primacy of Kemetic culture and its lasting impact on history and humanity are indisputable. That knowledge must not be suppressed, but celebrated.
There are lessons for all people, whether or not they are descendants of the African diaspora, in the culture, customs, and traditions of ancient Kemet. By opening our hearts and minds to the messages Kemets left for us, we can honor all that they achieved. The spirits of the first people, our people, in recreating their peace and harmony in our own culturally diverse and complex society.
That's what made my mentor, Dr. Clark, John Henry Clark, say, it is impossible to continue to oppress a consciously historical people. Any group of people who is conscious of its history can't be oppressed. You can hold them down for a minute, they will always remobilize.
The Me Complete Kwanzaa Kit has the hand-woven straw mat, handcrafted candle holder, the 7 candles, unity cup, and a poster-size illustration of the 7 principles of Kwanzaa. The Me Complete Kwanzaa Kit also has a specially designed user's guide.
The guide explains the history and principles of Kwanzaa. It even has children's activities, how to set your table, decorating tips, and how to prepare and schedule a Kwanzaa celebration to fit your lifestyle. For only $49.95, the Me Complete Kwanzaa Kit becomes an heirloom that can be passed down from generation to generation.
Call toll-free 1-877-ME-KITS. That's 1-877-MEEKITS. Or visit www.meekwanzaakit.com. If you want to change your life, it's time to stop making excuses. You can have a Kwanzaa celebration in your home this year by making one call. You can have everything you need for Kwanzaa delivered right to your door. The history, the 7 principles, and everything you need to decorate your home and table. Make time to rejuvenate your soul. Celebrate Kwanzaa. It speaks to us, who we are, where we've been, and the heritage that gives us the strength to get where we need to go.
Call toll-free 1-877-ME-KITS. That's 1-877-MEEKITS. Or visit www.meekwanzaakit.com. The website is a companion piece to the Me Complete Kwanzaa Kit video.
Kwanzaa. Share the tradition and pass it on.